Okay, so I got cut off on the second part of chapter 5 on civil rights. So we are going to go ahead and make a part 3, but it should be pretty brief. But I didn't want to leave out civil rights of Asian Americans and civil rights of citizens with disabilities, as well as affirmative action. So that's what this lesson will cover. Asian Americans are made up of a diverse group of people based in culture, religion, history, and language. Today, the largest percentage of Asian Americans have Chinese origins, followed by those who identify as Filipino, then Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese ancestry. Today, nearly 6% of the US population is Asian. The largest population of Asian Americans live in California, New York, Hawaii, Texas, New Jersey, and Illinois. Asian Americans have also fought for equal access to education and employment opportunities, as well as citizenship. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. That allowed Asian immigrants to become citizens for the first time. Before the passage of this law, only US born children of Asian immigrants could be citizens. One of the most significant civil rights violations in US history was Japanese internment. This happened during World War II when Americans of Japanese ancestry were forced to move to government-established camps. President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which displaced 120,000 Japanese Americans into relocated camps on the west coast of the United States. This is a response to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Even though the United States was also fighting against Germany and Italy, those immigrants were not displaced. It was just Japanese immigrants. However, there were some restrictions on travel for individuals with German and Italian ancestry. The Japanese American Citizenship League fought for reparations and for the repealment of the law allowing the imprisonment of citizens suspected of conspiring with an enemy country during times of war. They were successful in achieving those reparations as President Ronald Reagan signed a bill providing $1.2 billion in reparations. During the 1980s, Asian American organizations began to pay more attention to voting rights, as well as to hate crimes and employment discrimination. Many Asian American civil rights groups and organizations ended up combining and forming the NCAPA, which is known as the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. Its main purpose is to press for equal protection of the law for all Asians. Although Asian Americans do represent high percentages of college education and professional work, they also hit a glass ceiling where they are not as represented in higher level positions, and so much of their focus has really been on employment opportunities and equality in employment. Another push has been for Asian Americans to also take up leadership positions within politics. The next group we'll talk about is citizens with disabilities. The civil rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s made society more aware of the lack of equal protection of the laws for diverse groups of citizens, including people with disabilities. The first piece of civil rights legislation for citizens with disabilities was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This act prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in federally funded programs. Then in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act takes that a step further, and it extends the ban on discrimination against people with disabilities in education, employment, healthcare, housing, and transportation to all programs and organizations, not just to those receiving federal funds. The ADA also required employers and governmental organizations to make it possible for people with disabilities to participate meaningfully in their communities through reasonable accommodations. The last topic we'll be discussing is affirmative action. What is affirmative action? We can look at affirmative action in employment, and we can also look at it in education. If we're looking at it in the employment arena, it's the intentional effort to recruit, hire, train, and promote underutilized categories of workers. If we're talking about higher education, it's the intentional effort to diversify the student body. In 1961, President Kennedy used the term affirmative action in an executive order regarding the hiring and employment practices of projects performed by private contractors that were financed with federal funds. The order required that employers receiving federal funds take affirmative action to ensure that their hiring and employment practices were free of racial discrimination. President Lyndon B. Johnson extended Kennedy's affirmative action order to include inherent characteristics like race, color, religion, and national origin. He also extended affirmative action to include women. Many people do not understand affirmative action well enough and have misconceptions about how it's carried out. Affirmative action does not require organizations to hire unqualified candidates. It also does not require the hiring of a qualified minority candidate over a qualified non-minority candidate. It does require that an organization make intentional efforts to diversify its workforce by providing equal opportunity to classes of people that have been historically, and in many cases are still today, subject to discrimination. In the 1970s, institutions of higher education began to adopt intentional efforts to expand educational opportunities for both men and women from various minority groups. In addition, colleges and universities are affirmative action positive and ensure a student body that is diverse in race, color, economic status, and other characteristics. These institutions believe that having students on campus from a wide variety of backgrounds enhances all students' educational experience and best prepares them to function successfully in a nation that is increasingly diverse. Again, many people have misconceptions about why colleges consider race or ethnicity as a factor. Again, it is a factor. It is not the deciding reason that an individual is let into college. They typically meet all qualifications, and in addition to that, also have very similar application resumes, but their background is a factor that will be considered. And so rather than look at someone getting the upper hand because they fall into a minority group, it's actually seeing a value in a different experience that an individual may be able to share with other people on a college campus. I want you to really think about that because your academic experience goes beyond what you read in textbooks, goes beyond what you do in a classroom. It has very much to do with the exposure that you have to people who have different backgrounds, different experiences than you do. Think about what you've learned from the people who you surround yourself with that do have those experiences. Now, it is important to address a landmark important Supreme Court case that has to do with affirmative action. And so in this case, we will bring up the Bakke versus Regents of California Davis case. In 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court found unconstitutional the University of California at Davis's affirmative action plan for admission to its medical school. The Davis plan set aside 16 of the 100 seats in its first-year medical school class for racial minorities, specifically African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. The courts sided with Bakke on this case and determined that quota systems were unconstitutional. At the same time, it also allowed for a second interpretation, which is that race can be considered a factor in the application process. So long as it wasn't a quota system, but rather a factor considered, that was constitutional. In a later admissions case known as Grutter versus Bollinger, the Supreme Court further expanded on that permission or interpretation in allowing for affirmative action to take place as long as race was considered a factor among other factors. This is because a school's goal of creating a diverse student population serves a compelling public interest. A diverse student body enhances cross-racial understanding and breaks down racial stereotypes. It also helps students better understand persons of different races. The courts have continued to uphold affirmative action practices by higher educational institutions. However, many do believe that it may change or regress with future court cases.